Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 189, IO 539b to d. Socrates has been quoting lines from Homer, which purportedly belong to one or other techne, which is not the rhapsodic techne. Even if we take this seriously, we could say that at least the other techne deal with the subject matter of whatever they're talking about, but the rhapsodic techne deals with the form and delivery of the narrative of what's going on. Even then, we would have a problem, because what is the difference between a poet's techne and the rhapsode's techne? Because they would both be dealing with form. As for the content being intelligible mainly to the expert of a techne, or the techne itself, which is in effect the expert at any techne, we've had rather trivial examples such as 5 fingers or the weighted fishing hook or a simple medical recipe, which should have made Io think at least whether one really has to be an expert to judge whether Homer is speaking well about what he speaks, which is why I think Socrates is pushing the point to absurdity now with the techne of the prophet or the mantis, the seer of the future, who indeed would be able to decide whether the seer he has just quoted is speaking well, or whether Homer is speaking well when he has his seer speaking. If all we had was the prediction made by Theoclymenos about the souls of the suitors going down to hell, groaning and moaning because of something bad that is happening to them, nobody would be any the wiser whether Homer is speaking well or even Theoclymenos is speaking well. How would we know? The only way we would know if the prophecy is any good is by knowing what actually happens. And as it happens, in the Odyssey, we find out that Odysseus and Telemachus, his son, slaughter all the suitors. So we can then decide that the prophecy was well said. At least it was correct that something bad would happen to the suitors. There isn't much mention of the way the suitors will be killed, but it is implied that they would be killed because their souls go to Erebus. Why should a professional mantis, seer or prophet, have any advantage over a rhapsode in assessing whether Homer says what he says well? Perhaps as a mantis, he could say that that is the way a mantis speaks. But it's actually the rhapsode who knows what will happen a few hundred lines further on, and who can therefore adjudge the mantis to be accurate, at least, in some of the details, which technically a mantis would not be able to do. If a mantis were to be familiar with the end of the Odyssey, he would be enjoying the rhapsodike techne rather than the mantike techne. I should point out that the suitors didn't take the prophecy seriously, and we know better. Why? Because we know what actually happened afterwards. Socrates now gives yet another instance, which is a parallel, but it isn't a prophecy. This one is an omen, in other words, a sign from the gods, and it isn't taken seriously by the people who should have taken it seriously. And again, incidentally, we see Socrates being able to quote lines of Homer from various places, this time from the Iliad, as he says. Polechoudekai en Iliadi, hoionkai epitechomachia. Everywhere also in the Iliad, such as on the wall fight. Socrates is referring to the Trojan attack on the ships of the Greeks. The Trojans had reached the defensive wall before the ships and were doing quite well, but then suddenly there was an omen. Legegar kai entautha. For he, that is Homer says, also here, ornis gars finepelthe pere semenai memausin, aietos hypsepetes, eperistera laon evergon, foine ente draconta feron, onichesi peloron, zovon, et aspai ronta, kai upo lethetok harmes, copsegar auton echonta katastethos paraderen, idno thes opiso, hodopo hethen heke chamadze, alge sas odunesi, mesod heni kabbal homillo, autos de clanxas petetop noies anemoio. For a bird came to them as they were eager to break through. That is to say, while the Trojans were trying to break through the Greek defences, the wall, that's when the bird flew over. A high-flying eagle hemming the army in from the left. And we don't have to be experts to know that birds flying from the left are a bad omen, carrying a blood-red dragon in its claws as an omen. I say dragon because the Greek is drakon, but that could also be a snake. So the eagle is carrying a red snake in its claws. Alive, still struggling. This is a description of the snake, not the eagle, of course. And it had not yet forgotten its lust for battle. It smote it, holding it in the chest by the throat, doubled up backwards. That is, the dragon or the snake was doubled up backwards, and it bit the eagle in the chest by the throat. And it threw it away from itself towards the ground. In other words, the eagle dropped the snake, suffering with pains. This is the eagle. This is why it dropped the snake. And it threw it down in the middle of the throng. In other words, the snake fell into the Trojan army, where it could bother them the way the snake had bothered the eagle, which had been successful. It had been on its way to eat the snake somewhere before the snake retaliated. And this is obviously the point of the omen. The Greeks will retaliate against the erstwhile successful Trojans. But it, that is the eagle, crying, shrieking, flew on the breezes of the wind. The point isn't so much that it is flying, that's what eagles do, it's that it was screeching, it was in pain. What's interesting here is that the omen is interpreted correctly in the Iliad by Polydamas, and he tells Hector that they should abandon the assault, because the Trojans, like the eagle, may take what they wanted to take, but then they will suffer retaliation and ultimately lose their objective. Although Polydamas warns Hector that this omen obviously is not in their favor because the bird flew from the left side of the Trojan army, Hector refused to take his advice and the Trojans suffered a defeat. So far as I'm aware, Polydamas is not supposed to be a mantis or a seer or an augur of any type in the Iliad. He is a warrior, just like Hector, but while Hector is a bit reckless, Polydamas is very cautious. We might almost say he is wise. And he gives good counsel, which Hector ignores. This isn't the only place where that happens in the Iliad. So Socrates has finished his quote, but he doesn't repeat his question whether it should be the rhapsode or the mantis who decides whether Homer is speaking well. In fact, he ignores Homer altogether now. He also doesn't ask a question. Tauta feso kai ta toiauta to mante prosekin kai skopen kai krinen. Alithegesu legono Socrates. I shall claim that these things and things like these are fitting for a mantis, both to examine and to judge. Saying true things, Socrates, you, and it is understood that he means you will claim. If you claim this, then you'll be correct. For the sake of argument, we may agree that it is most fitting for a mantis to observe and judge an omen, but this is at the time of the omen, on the assumption that the mantis is most experienced when it comes to interpreting this sort of thing. But this is the Iliad, and in the Iliad we have the results as well. And Homer, if we accept Homer for now, Homer has invented this omen knowing what it will lead to, and he even has someone who isn't a mantis interpreting the omen correctly, and someone else who is also not a mantis ignoring the interpretation given. We end up with a situation in which ordinary people, all the people who are not mantis, people who are not prophets or seers or augurs, would all think that the omen was accurate because it led to the retreat of the Trojans. The omen is far-fetched, it wasn't believed, and for the mantis it could be said to have been a waste of time. But poetically it built up the anticipation before the downfall of the Trojans. The mantike techne is the most problematic of the examples Socrates has given so far.